Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
Okay, so we were just sitting up here and Lee was saying what a radical bunch of presentations we've had so far. And so I propose to be the man of the establishment. And I'm going to talk about Ontario's renewable energy policies, and in particular, what it is we can take away from our experience of a decade or so of really aggressively promoting renewable energy in Ontario. I'll just start with a bit of context, although it's probably not needed at this point. Ontario has undergone major transformations in its electricity industry a number of times in the past. So as an example, it invested heavily in nuclear in the 1960s to 1980s. It was one of the two jurisdictions in Canada to try the deregulation experiment in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so it's no stranger to big changes in the electricity sector. In around 2005, it initiated another big change in the electricity sector, and that was with the Integrated Power System Plan, and then reinforced with the 2013 Long-Term Energy Plan. And both of those documents they envisioned big transformations in the way that Ontario generated electricity, the way it transmitted electricity, talked about even the way it governed electricity. So these created the Ontario Power Authority. But what I want to focus on here is this bottom bullet, that these two plans envisioned the generation, the wholesale transformation of Ontario's electricity generating capacity towards renewables. I should say not wholesale, about half of the generating capacity towards renewables. So Ontario generates has a capacity of about 32 gigawatts or 32,000 megawatts of electricity. By 2025, the aim is to have 20,000 of that 32,000 be from renewables. And the part I want to talk about today is the new renewables component. This is the non-hydro, the alternative energy, the alternative renewables, the wind and solar portion. And the goal in these two documents is to have 10,000 megawatts of new renewables in around 2020 from a base of about zero. So this is a big transformation in Ontario's electricity system. And based on those documents, the Ontario Power Authority, which was created by those documents, started an aggressive portfolio of policies, or I guess a stage of policies to start procuring renewable energy. In the first phase of those policies, 2005 to 2008, was an auction-type system, a procurement system for large renewables. It procured about 1,500 megawatts of new renewable capacity, mostly wind capacity, in a competitive procurement process. This is a really oversubscribed call for proposals. Shortly after that, it launched the Renewable Energy Standard Offer Program. So this is a kind of loosely modeled on the German feed-in tariff program. It's trying to reduce transaction costs, especially for smaller projects. So signing up to a competitive procurement process takes a lot of lawyers, and so this RESOP policy was aimed at dramatically reducing the transaction costs associated with competitive procurement. And then in 2011, we've heard lots about this already. The Ontario Power Authority launched the feed-in tariff program, and that was building on this RESOP program, but it provided transmission system access rather than just distribution system access. So rather than connecting to the local distribution grids, it was connecting projects to the transmission grids. It removed caps on project size, so rather than just soliciting small projects, it was soliciting big projects, and it dramatically pushed up the rates, the tariff rates for renewable energy. And the net result of these three policies is a dramatic increase in the amount of renewable energy that we've had in Ontario, or that we generate in Ontario. And so the left-hand figure shows, or the right-hand figure shows, your left, my right. The blue and red figure shows the capacity from wind and solar generating facilities in Ontario. This is the kind of rapid ramp up we have in Germany. We now generate about a quarter of our capacity from just wind and solar. So again, our capacity is about 32,000 megawatts. We have about 8,000 megawatts of wind and solar in Ontario now. And we now lead the Canadian provinces in renewable energy in Ontario. So the right-hand figure shows this is wind only capacity. Ontario gets about 15% of its capacity from wind right now, another 10% or so from solar. It's by far the leader in Canadian provinces in the capacity for these new renewables. And so what I want to talk about today is what we can take away from this decade of promoting renewable energy in Ontario. And I'm going to focus on kind of the economic lessons we can draw. I know that my other panelists and other people who have spoken have focused much more on kind of the community side of things and the social experience with these projects. But I want to make 3 points. The first is that procuring electricity non-competitively can significantly add to costs. So these feed-in tariffs are not competitive procurement programs, unlike the previous ones that preceded them. That fixed tariffs, which are provided by the feed-in tariff policy, that don't account for capacity or don't account for the time that the electricity is generated, become less efficient the more that renewable energy penetrates into the grid. We're sort of starting to see that in Ontario now. And this is more of a qualitative lesson that adding multiple goals to a policy can increase costs, and these extra goals should be carefully scrutinized, and that wasn't done when Ontario adopted its feed-in tariff policy. So I'll talk about each of those in turn. People have presented this figure on the right-hand side a lot over the last few years. And so if you read op-eds in the papers, you'll see reference to the dramatic increase in costs of electricity in Ontario. So since 2006, when we started procuring electricity in Ontario, prices are up by about 80%. And I think this has started to generate a backlash against renewable energy. In fact, it certainly started to generate a backlash. It's one of the things that's generated a backlash. The first thing I'll say is that it's important to clarify that not all of this increase, the top blue line is the total commodity cost for electricity, not all of this increase is due to renewables. There's been a bunch of studies that have tried to estimate how much is due to renewables. I think the Auditor General in a 2011 report provided a good estimate, and it was up at the kind of half of that increase is due to the renewable procurement process. But it depends a lot on what you take to be the counterfactual. So if you take the hourly electricity price to be the counterfactual, it looks like renewables have added an awful lot to the electricity cost. If you take the long-term contracts for gas that have been signed concurrently with the feed-in tariff as the counterfactual, then the increase has been much smaller. But the point I want to make here is that the policy design in Ontario likely amplified the cost much more than necessary. So if we designed policy differently, we could have had the same outcome in terms of renewable energy amount, but had lower costs. And in particular, I'm going to highlight a couple of things, but I want to start out by coming to this notion that the FIT and RESOP programs are not competitive programs. In other words, they offer a fixed tariff on all electricity that's generated. The way that tariff is calculated, at least for the feed-in tariff program, was that it was designed to generate an 11% return on investment for investors, so an attractive return on investment. So it's a sensible kind of way to design this policy. But it doesn't recognize the fact that renewable energy sites are really heterogeneous. And so if you provide a 11% return for an average site, you're going to provide a much better than 11% return for a better than average site. It also, there's a every 2 year review of the FIT prices, but over the course of 2 years, renewable energy prices for the actual equipment fell by 40 or 50% over the period that the FIT was implemented. And so something that sounded like a sensible price in 2009 was a crazy price in 2011. And the Ontario Energy Board and the OPA who set these prices were kind of really slow to recognize this, to keep up with the changes in trends. And so the Auditor General report in particular highlights the ground-mounted solar installations, which were offered a premium or a tariff of 80 cents a kilowatt hour. And almost immediately after the policy the feed-in tariff was brought in, it was 16,000 applications. They were drowning in applications, and the OPA who did some analysis and said, you only need to offer 40 cents because you're offering them rates of return of 30–35% because the technology cost has dropped so quickly. And so to give you another illustration of this overcompensation, this is a figure that shows the relationship between the capacity factor of a wind turbine, which is how often it's operating at rated capacity throughout the year, and the cost of electricity that it generates. And so you can see that the wind farms that are actually in operation in Ontario operate anywhere between around a 25% and 35% capacity factor. That black line is what the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory calculates as the cost of generating electricity from wind at given capacity factor. So if the capacity factor is 35 cents or 35%, the NREL calculates an $80 a megawatt hour or 8 cents a kilowatt hour cost of renewable energy. And in that first phase, I remember I talked about this 3 phases of renewable energy deployment in Ontario. That first phase in Ontario, this competitive phase, they sourced 1,500 megawatts of capacity, and the bids came in at about 9 to 9.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So it really, lines up well with what the NREL thinks it costs to generate renewable energy. The feed-in tariff provided 13.5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's now down to 12.8 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's dramatically overcompensating these renewable energy facilities. It's not forcing them to compete with each other to get access to the grid. It provides 13.5 cents to anyone, even though it might only cost 9 cents or 8 cents to generate the electricity. So that's my first point. The second point is around the intermittency, and this is something we all know a lot about in the case of renewable energy, I think, but I want to just provide a couple of figures. So I think there's 2 important characteristics in the case of renewable energy. First of all, it's intermittent, so it only generates electricity when the wind blows or when the sun shines. And the second thing that maybe we don't think about quite as much is that once renewable energy is installed, it provides electricity at basically 0 cost. This is this merit order effect I'll talk about. But those 2 facts, I think, are something we want to take into account when we design our renewable energy policy. So if you take this fact that renewable energy generates electricity at 0 marginal cost once the facility is built. In other words, once you have a wind turbine built, it doesn't cost anything else to accept electricity from the wind turbine. So when you've got this renewable energy facility built, generating electricity at 0 marginal cost, anytime it produces electricity, it displaces costly generators, right? So it displaces generators that cost more. And it pushes down the wholesale price of electricity. This is a good thing. This is what German researchers have identified as the merit order effect. So it's going to push stations that are way up high in the merit order, the costly stations. It's going to push them out of the electricity market. But as renewable energy supply ramps up, the generators that are getting pushed out of the market are going to be lower and lower cost generators, and eventually they get to be the 0 cost generators. And so let me just give you an illustration of what's going on here. The black line is a market with no renewables. This is the supply cost we see. The OPA will show you figures like this, or the ISO, sorry, will show you figures like this, where there's typically a big flat period of supply in any given hour, or 0 cost period of supply in any given hour that reflects the nuclear and hydro and renewable stations. And then you look at the demand curve slopes up as we get into the peaking stations. As we add more renewables in, we push that supply curve off to the right, and we displace these higher energy plants. The thing that I want to raise is that as we start adding more and more renewables in any given hour, we start pushing plants out that are cheaper and cheaper. So the value of that extra wind that we're generating is dropping each time. And so we can see that in this figure that I produced here, which shows the value of wind relative to the average price of electricity in the grid. So in 2007, when we first started implementing a lot of wind energy, it was more or less the energy we're displacing was more or less the average price of electricity on the grid. But as we start getting more and more electricity on the grid, it starts pushing out lower and lower cost generators, and so the value of wind energy gets less and less. And currently, the structure of the feed-in tariff doesn't reflect this changing value of wind energy, because it offers the same price for each unit of electricity generated. The last point I want to make is a more qualitative point, and it's that the Green Energy and Green Economy Act, which was the piece of legislation that supported the feed-in tariff development, had a number of secondary objectives in addition to promoting renewable energy. So it had an objective to create 50,000 green jobs, to kickstart a new renewable energy manufacturing industry in Ontario, and also to provide a diversified portfolio of renewable energy assets, things like wind and solar and waste heat. And these, I think, were not carefully enough scrutinized. If you read the Ontario Auditor General report, they'll come to the same conclusion. These extra objectives didn't pass a cost-benefit test. It wasn't always clear what market failure was being addressed by the extra objective. And so the idea, for example, of generating a renewable energy industry in Ontario, a government-generated renewable energy industry in Ontario, it's not clear what market failure that's addressing or why we need a government policy to kickstart a renewable energy industry in Ontario. And the design of the renewable energy policy wasn't always well connected to the objectives that were articulated in the Green Energy and Green Economy Act. And I think it's clear that in some cases these extra objectives added to the cost of the policy. And so as an example, local content requirements pushed up the cost of renewable energy in the province. And costs were estimated, if this was a job creating strategy, well, the jobs that it turned out to be quite costly to create. Likewise, the 50,000 jobs that were created, estimates suggest that there was if the feed-in tariff is a mechanism to create jobs, it's an expensive way to create jobs, and it didn't the policy design didn't take into account enough the potential negative effects on employment on other sectors. So I'll just finish up there. I think I'm just about on time. Yeah. Ontario has really rapidly transformed its electricity sector over the past decade, and the policies, it's clear, were really successful in diffusing large amounts of renewable electricity. And my contention is that the way the policies were designed likely generated much more costs than were needed to generate the same amount of electricity. Or another way to say that is that we could have generated more electricity, more renewable electricity, for the same costs. And I think, going forward, there's obviously changes underway already. We've kind of moved away from this feed-in tariff program. But I think that the idea of procuring electricity competitively has some merits. It makes sure we don't overcompensate particular developers. The idea of procuring electricity where we don't just think about the energy that's being provided, but think about the effect on the capacity as well. In other words, think about what time of the day or what time of the year the electricity is being provided. I think that starts to get more important as we start to get more and more renewable electricity into the grid. And then I would say, as for any policy, we really want to think about what the objectives of the policy are, and we should really scrutinize those objectives. And once we're satisfied with the objectives, we should make sure that the policy connects well with the objectives of the policy. And I don't think that was done in the Green Energy and Green Economy Act. Thanks very much.